Sweat hit the canvas, carrying the sour reek of cheap draft beer and raw anticipation. 45,000 throats screamed for a slaughter. Magnus loomed, a mountain of bruised knuckles and arrogance. "I'll crush you easily," he spat. Bruce didn't smile. He just scraped his bare soles against the mat. Concrete dust coated the soles of Bruce's bare feet. He rubbed his big toe against the rough floor of the locker room tunnel, feeling a jagged little pebble bite into his skin. He didn't brush it away. The sharp, localized pain grounded him, cutting through the low-frequency seismic hum of 45,000 people, losing their minds in the colossal stadium above. It smelled like stale urine, spilled gin, and damp ozone down here in the dark, far away from the sanitized myth of martial arts. Behind him, an undercard fighter was violently throwing up in a plastic janitor's bucket, the acidic smell mixing with the stagnant air. Bruce didn't turn around. This was the raw, unglamorous reality of the fight game. No Zen gardens, no flowing silk robes, just nervous bowels, cheap promoters, and men willing to irreparably damage themselves for a paycheck and a fleeting moment of applause. He looked down at his own hands. He hadn't wrapped them. He preferred the raw, honest feedback of skin and bone connecting against an opponent, the absolute certainty of the strike. But looking at the scarred brickwork of the tunnel, he felt a fleeting pulse of doubt. The man waiting for him upstairs wasn't a technician. He was a freak of genetics and unhinged anger. Carter, a sweat-drenched promoter with a desperate comb-over plastered to his skull, chewed on a cheap frayed cigar beside him. His cheap leather shoes squeaked incessantly against the slick concrete. "Listen, Bruce, just survive 3 rounds. Give them a show. He's huge, but he's slow." Bruce ignored him. He rolled his left shoulder. A dull, hot ache throbbed right behind his collarbone, a leftover from a stupid, heavy sparring session 3 days ago. He wasn't a pristine, flawless machine. He was tired. His lower back was brutally stiff from the sagging, humid hotel mattress he'd slept on, and he had a lingering headache from the relentless glare of the press flash bulbs at the weigh-in. He hawked up a bit of phlegm and spat it into a rusted iron grate nearby. I told the press you'd finish him in 2, Carter babbled, wiping his shiny forehead with a soiled handkerchief. "Don't make a liar out of me, kid. The syndicates have heavy money on the over-under. You hear me?" Carter pressed, his breath foul with wet tobacco and stale black coffee. "Yeah, I hear you, Carter," Bruce said softly. His voice was raspy, dry. He shot the promoter a look so cold the man physically recoiled. "But I fight for myself. Not your syndicates, not your over-under. If you talk to me again before I step on that canvas, I'll break your jaw before I break his. I'm not here to survive." He stepped out of the shadows and into the tunnel's exit. The wall of sound physically shoved against his chest. It wasn't a cheer. It was a guttural, terrifyingly bloodthirsty roar. 45,000 faces blurred into a single, writhing, shadowy mass in the stands of the open-air arena. Halogen lights blazed mercilessly overhead, baking the moisture out of the night air. The canvas of the ring looked agonizingly far away, a glaring island of white under a harsh yellow spotlight. Bruce walked down the narrow aisle, fans shoved against the steel barricades, their faces distorted with aggression. He could see the high rollers in silk suits sitting shoulder to shoulder with dock workers missing half their teeth. The great equalizer of violence. A woman with too much rouge screamed something unintelligible at him, her eyes wide with a manic, ugly excitement. A half-empty cup of soda sailed past his head, splashing sticky, warm syrup onto the fabric of his black trousers. He didn't flinch, but his jaw locked so hard his teeth ached. Irritation flared, hot, sharp, and intensely human. These people didn't care about discipline, speed, or the geometry of combat. They wanted a circus. They wanted to see the small, intense man snapped in half by the giant. Climbing the metal stairs, his bare feet felt the heavy vibrations already shaking the ring floorboards. He slipped through the coarse hemp ropes. They smelled of dried sweat and harsh industrial cleaner. In the opposite corner stood Magnus. They called him the Viking. 6'6", 280 pounds of heavily scarred, pale muscle. He didn't look like a disciplined fighter. He looked like a barroom brawler who had made a career out of crippling other barroom brawlers. Magnus was beating his heavily tattooed chest, roaring at the crowd, bathing in the chaotic noise. He wore minimal wrapping on his massive hands, his knuckles a jagged landscape of thick purple calluses. Bruce stood in his corner, a stark contrast at 5'7", 145 pounds. He didn't strike a cinematic pose. He didn't look serenely confident. He frowned deeply, scratching the side of his neck, cold-bloodedly assessing the sheer volume of mass across from him. He felt a distinct flicker of genuine apprehension. A single clean hit from a man that size would instantly shatter his orbital bone or unhinge his jaw. It was simple, undeniable physics. The cold math of mass and velocity. Davis, the referee, a bald, trembling man looking thoroughly out of his depth, gestured them frantically to the center of the ring. Magnus marched forward, the wooden boards groaning in protest under his weight. Bruce walked out, stepping lightly, testing the grip of the canvas. It was slick. Too much wax applied to the fibers. He'd have to adjust his pivoting or risk blowing out a knee. They stood nose to chest. The stench radiating off Magnus was overwhelming. Wintergreen liniment, old dried sweat, and something inherently sour like fermented meat. Magnus looked down, his pale blue eyes dilated wide with adrenaline and absolute contempt. "I'll crush you easily," Magnus spat. Specks of hot saliva hit Bruce's cheek. Bruce didn't deliver a philosophical one-liner. He didn't smile peacefully to show he was above it all. He wiped the spit off his face with the back of his hand, his eyes narrowing into cold slits. He hated this guy, not out of some high-minded martial arts principle, but out of sheer visceral annoyance at the man's loud, suffocating arrogance. "Back up," Bruce muttered, his voice barely audible over the roaring crowd, but vibrating with lethal intent. "You smell like shit." Magnus blinked, the petty insult taking a full second to penetrate the thick fog of his adrenaline. His thick face flushed a violent violet. He lunged forward before the bell even rang. Davis blew the whistle, backpedaling so fast he nearly tripped over his own feet as the giant surged. Magnus didn't throw a martial arts punch. He threw a looping, horrifying haymaker meat hook, a blow designed purely to tear a head off its shoulders. Bruce shifted his weight, dropping his center of gravity instantly. He had subconsciously expected Magnus to be slow. He was wrong. The massive fist clipped the air a mere inch from Bruce's nose, the sheer displacement of wind stinging his eyes. The trunk-like arm followed through, heavily grazing Bruce's shoulder. Searing pain shot down Bruce's left arm, radiating outward from his already aching collarbone. He grimaced, stumbling half a step. The canvas was definitely too slick. His heel skidded uncontrollably. The crowd immediately erupted into derisive laughter, 45,000 voices viciously mocking his stumble. Magnus didn't pause to gloat. He charged like a derailed freight train, wrapping his massive arms out wide to crush Bruce into a suffocating bear hug. Bruce backpedaled desperately, feeling the rough hemp ropes bite aggressively into his spine. No room to retreat. He planted his right foot hard, deliberately ignoring the slickness of the mat, and fired a straight lead punch directly down the center line. Smack. His bare knuckles connected absolutely flush with Magnus's jaw. It was a perfect textbook strike, generating kinetic power from the floor up through the torque of the hip. But hitting Magnus felt exactly like punching a tightly packed sack of wet sand. A sharp, warning pain echoed violently back up Bruce's own wrist. He had hit too hard against solid, unyielding bone without the forgiving give of a padded glove. Magnus barely blinked. He grinned, revealing a jaggedly chipped front tooth, and swung a lazy but terrifying backhand. Bruce ducked underneath it, but the giant's massive, sweat-slicked bicep caught him hard on the side of the head. Sparks burst brilliantly in Bruce's peripheral vision. His ears immediately rang, a high-pitched, persistent whine drowning out the chaotic stadium noise. He tasted hot copper, bitten tongue. He spun out of the corner, breathing rapidly through his nose, tasting his own blood at the back of his throat. He's not just big, he's incredibly dense. My strikes are bouncing off his jaw, Bruce thought, wiping a bright smear of red from the corner of his mouth. The cynical voice in his head, the one that had warned him this whole freak show exhibition was a massive mistake, screamed at him to stay on the outside, to jab, to run out the clock and survive. But his pride was a living, breathing, stubborn thing. It burned in the center of his chest, hot and heavy. Bruce didn't wait for the giant to recover his balance. He closed the gap aggressively, slipping to the outside of Magnus's massive right arm, and unleashed a rapid-fire chain of punches, tap, tap, bang. A stinging back fist to the bridge of the nose, a vertical fist driven into the sternum, ending with a heavy turning hook to the rib cage. The strikes landed with loud percussive snaps that echoed sharply off the concrete tiers of the stadium. Drops of sweat flew violently from Magnus's chest, but Magnus just absorbed it. He didn't crumble. He didn't even wince. The sheer density of his musculature acted like 2 inches of thick rubber armor. Bruce felt a genuine jolt of alarm ping through his nervous system. It was like striking the trunk of an old oak tree. Magnus roared, a guttural sound of pure, unadulterated rage, and swung his massive forearms together in a crushing clap, aiming squarely for Bruce's head. Bruce dropped into a deep squat, feeling the violent rush of displaced air as the giant's arms collided inches above his skull. The sound of Magnus's own thick forearms slapping together was as loud as a shotgun blast. If that had caught Bruce's temples, it would have been lights out. Coma. Maybe a fractured skull. Bruce rolled rapidly across the slick canvas, his bare skin picking up coarse grit and dark, old bloodstains from previous fights. He sprang to his feet in the opposite corner, his chest heaving. His right hand throbbed mercilessly. His knuckles were already swelling, turning a deep, angry shade of purple. The crowd aggressively booed. They thought Bruce was running away. They rained down profanities, demanding the small man stand in the center and trade fatal blows with the behemoth. "Come here, little rat," Magnus taunted, pounding his own chest until the pale skin turned raw red. He was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling in massive heaves, but he looked completely structurally undamaged. Bruce narrowed his eyes, wiping his mouth again. "Okay," he thought, his rising frustration suddenly giving way to a cold, frighteningly clinical detachment. Blunt force to the head and chest is a waste of kinetic energy. Structural failure. Target the architectural supports. He looked at Magnus, really looked at him. The heavy swings were draining the giant's oxygen rapidly. More importantly, Magnus's left knee wore a thick, tightly strapped neoprene brace. The flesh bulging around the top of the brace looked slightly puffy, inflamed. Magnus rushed again, abandoning his hands and leading with a heavy stomping front kick designed to cave in a chest cavity. This time, Bruce didn't retreat an inch. He stepped directly into the attack, closing the dangerous distance instantly, slipping inside the wide, clumsy arc of the giant's heavy leg. He pivoted sharply, transferring every ounce of his weight into his heel, and fired a low, blindingly fast oblique kick straight into Magnus's braced left knee. The sound was absolutely sickening. A wet, tearing pop beneath the tight neoprene, immediately followed by the dull, horrific thud of cartilage giving way and bone grating raw against bone. Magnus didn't roar this time. He shrieked. It was a high, thin, terrifyingly vulnerable sound that completely betrayed his massive frame. His massive momentum carried him forward, but his left leg buckled inward at a grotesque, unnatural angle. Bruce didn't hesitate. He felt no pity. As Magnus pitched violently forward, totally off balance and screaming in agony, Bruce pivoted again. He sank his weight low into his hips, anchored his feet on the slick mat, and drove a short, utterly brutal upward hook directly into Magnus's exposed liver. The impact was entirely different this time. It didn't feel like hitting unyielding bone. It felt deep, heavy, his fists sinking devastatingly into the soft, vital tissue of the giant's torso. Magnus stopped dead. His eyes bulged out of his skull. All the flushed color completely drained from his face in a millisecond, leaving him a sickening, clammy shade of gray. The massive, dangerous hands dropped limply to his sides as his brain desperately registered the catastrophic systemic shock of the liver strike. Bruce pulled his fist back, his knuckles raw and bleeding, his breathing perfectly controlled now. The stadium, previously a deafening roar of bloodlust, suddenly went completely, eerily silent. 45,000 people sucked in their breath at exactly the same moment. The only sound left in the massive arena was Magnus's wet, desperate, whistling wheeze as the giant slowly, agonizingly began to fold. Magnus didn't fall. The giant remained suspended on one knee, his massive torso listing to the side. The sickening wheeze escaping his lips sounded like a punctured tire. Davis, the referee, stood frozen a few feet away, his pale hands hovering uselessly in the air. The 45,000 spectators remained in that eerie, breathless vacuum. They had paid for a slaughter, but their primitive brains couldn't process the sudden, violent reversal of the food chain. Bruce didn't celebrate. His right hand was a throbbing, useless lump of meat. He stepped back, keeping his chin tucked, his eyes locked on the giant's heaving chest. Stay down, Bruce thought, a cold bead of sweat dripping stinging salt into his left eye. He didn't want to hit the man again. The structural integrity of his own knuckles wouldn't survive another impact against Magnus's skull. But the Viking was a different breed of animal. A low, vibrating growl started deep in Magnus's throat, shaking the spit loose from his lips. Adrenaline, dark and frantic, overrode the catastrophic failure of his liver. Magnus's pale eyes snapped up, heavily bloodshot, fixating on Bruce with pure, unadulterated hatred. Magnus lunged not upward, but forward, shooting his massive arms out across the slick canvas. Bruce tried to pivot away, but his heel caught a patch of fresh sweat. His foot skidded out from under him. The arena lights spun violently overhead. Before Bruce's shoulders even hit the mat, Magnus's thick tree trunk arms clamped around his waist. The weight was suffocating. 280 pounds of dense, panicked muscle collapsed directly onto Bruce's chest. The air blew violently out of Bruce's lungs. Black spots immediately swarmed his peripheral vision. The crowd erupted. The silence shattered into a deafening, chaotic frenzy. This was what they wanted. The primal, ugly dirt of a street fight. Magnus didn't try to punch. He buried his heavy stubbled chin into Bruce's collarbone and simply squeezed. It was a bear hug born of desperation, a crude, horrifying python grip meant to crush ribs and collapse lungs. The stench of the giant up close was nauseating, old blood, sour stomach acid, and the sharp chemical reek of cheap hair pomade. Bruce gasped, his rib cage groaning under the immense pressure. A sharp, terrifying pop echoed near his sternum. Panic, real and cold, spiked in his gut. There was no leverage down here, no geometry, no elegant Wing Chun trapping, just the brutal, unavoidable physics of a man twice his size crushing him to death on a dirty canvas floor. His legs kicked wildly, heels thumping uselessly against the back of Magnus's massive thighs. The giant simply ground his hips down harder. Breathe, Bruce told himself, fighting the overwhelming urge to thrash. Panic consumes oxygen. He went momentarily limp, saving his diminishing reserves. The giant, sensing the lack of resistance, shifted his weight slightly higher to completely suffocate Bruce's airways. That fractional shift was all the opening Bruce needed. Bruce dragged his left hand upward, his forearm scraping raw against the coarse texture of Magnus's sweat-soaked chest. He didn't aim for a pressure point. He didn't execute a complex joint lock. He found the fleshy, cartilage-heavy base of Magnus's nose. With every ounce of desperate strength left in his shoulder, Bruce drove the heel of his palm upward, shoving the giant's nose violently toward his brain. Blood sprayed instantly, a hot, sticky mist that coated Bruce's face. Magnus shrieked, a wet, gargling sound, his head snapping backward to relieve the agonizing pressure. The vice grip loosened. Bruce didn't hesitate. He jammed his right knee directly into the soft gap between Magnus's thigh and groin, creating a wedge of space. He violently twisted his hips, tearing himself out from under the crushing weight, leaving a smear of his own skin on the canvas. He scrambled to his feet, gasping raggedly, his chest burning as if he had swallowed broken glass. He spit a mouthful of bloody saliva onto the floor. His left shoulder was practically numb. Magnus rolled onto his hands and knees, violently shaking his head. Blood poured from his nostrils, painting the white canvas a slick, ugly crimson. The Viking pushed himself up, his ruined left leg dragging uselessly behind him. He looked like a slaughtered bull refusing to die. Davis finally found his voice, stepping in cautiously. "Hey! Hey! You want to call it?" Magnus swatted the referee away with a backhand that sent the smaller man tumbling through the ropes and crashing into the press tables below. The crowd roared, completely unhinged now. The fight had officially devolved into a riotous spectacle. Carter, the promoter, was screaming something from ringside, his face purple, but the words were drowned out by the sheer deafening volume of the mob. Bruce backed into a neutral corner, his chest heaving, his muscles vibrating with intense lactic acid exhaustion. He looked at Magnus. The giant was blind in one eye from the swelling, bleeding profusely, heavily limping, and breathing in shallow, ragged gasps. But he was still coming. Bruce felt a profound, bitter disgust. Not for Magnus, but for the entire system, for the screaming suits in the front row, the bloodthirsty dock workers, the cheap cigar smoke. They didn't see the catastrophic damage happening to the human body in front of them. They just saw meat grinding against meat. "Stay down, you stupid bastard," Bruce muttered under his breath, his voice cracking. He didn't want to permanently maim the man, but the Viking was beyond reason. He was operating purely on the reptilian brainstem. Magnus dragged his left leg forward, raising his massive, blood-slicked fists. He spat a thick glob of crimson onto the mat. "I'll kill you," he wheezed, the words bubbling through the blood in his throat. Bruce dropped his hands entirely. He stood perfectly still, his breathing slowing down. The panic from the grappling exchange evaporated, replaced by a cold, surgical emptiness. If the giant wanted to push it to the absolute end, Bruce would oblige. Magnus charged. It was a grotesque parody of his opening rush. The explosive speed was gone, replaced by a heavy, lumbering desperation. He dragged his shattered knee, his massive shoulders rolling, leading with a wild, looping overhand right aimed squarely at Bruce's jaw. Bruce didn't retreat. He didn't block. Blocking a strike from a man that size, even a slow one, would shatter his forearm. He waited until the very last microsecond, his eyes tracking the trajectory of the giant's bloody knuckles. When the fist was 6 inches from his face, Bruce simply slipped his head to the outside. The massive punch grazed his ear, the sheer friction tearing the skin. Magnus's momentum carried him hopelessly forward, entirely off balance. His chin was completely exposed, hanging over Bruce's right shoulder. Bruce didn't use a fist. His knuckles were already compromised. Instead, he planted his left foot firmly, torquing his hips with violent, explosive precision, and drove the point of his right elbow directly into the side of Magnus's neck, striking the vagus nerve and the carotid artery simultaneously. Crack. It wasn't a loud sound. It was dull, dense, the sound of a heavy wooden bat hitting a wet sandbag. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. Magnus's eyes rolled back in his head, exposing the red, swollen whites. His nervous system simply shut down. The massive legs gave way completely. He didn't stumble. He collapsed like a demolished building, 280 pounds of dead weight crashing face first onto the blood-soaked canvas. The ring physically bounced under the impact. Dust drifted up from the floorboards under the harsh halogen lights. Magnus lay perfectly still. Bruce stood over him. He didn't raise his arms in victory. He didn't scream at the crowd. He looked down at the giant, watching the shallow, erratic rise and fall of Magnus's massive back. The man would live, but he wouldn't fight again. The cartilage in that knee was powder. Slowly, Bruce turned toward the crowd. The 45,000 people were on their feet. The noise was apocalyptic. They were cheering, screaming, throwing half-empty cups of beer and crumpled betting slips into the air. They were celebrating him. They were worshiping the violence he had just committed. Bruce felt absolutely nothing but a hollow, aching exhaustion. His ribs throbbed mercilessly. His right hand felt like it was on fire. His ear was bleeding, the warm liquid trickling down his neck and soaking into the collar of his black shirt. He smelled the iron tang of Magnus's blood on his own skin. Carter scrambled under the ropes, his cheap suit stained with someone else's spilled drink. He rushed toward Bruce, a manic, greedy grin stretching across his sweaty face. "You did it! You beautiful, crazy kid! You actually did it! The syndicates are going to flip!" Carter reached out to grab Bruce's arm and raise it for the photographers who were already swarming the ring apron. Bruce slapped Carter's hand away. The movement was sharp, dismissive, and entirely devoid of performance. "Don't touch me," Bruce said, his voice a dry, raspy whisper that cut through the noise purely by its absolute coldness. Carter froze, his manic smile faltering. "Hey, come on, kid. This is your moment. The papers are going to eat this up." Bruce ignored him. He turned his back on the promoter, the blinding flashbulbs and the screaming thousands. He walked toward the ropes. His legs felt heavy, entirely drained of adrenaline. He slipped through the coarse hemp, ignoring the journalists shoving microphones toward his bleeding face. A medical team was finally rushing the ring, carrying a stretcher for the giant. Bruce walked right past them. He descended the steel stairs, his bare feet hitting the concrete floor of the arena. The noise of the crowd washed over him, a meaningless, chaotic ocean of sound. He walked back down the narrow, dimly lit tunnel. It smelled exactly the same as it had 20 minutes ago. Stale urine, spilled gin, and damp ozone. The sharp pebble he had stepped on earlier was still there. He stepped on it again. The localized pain grounded him once more, pulling him away from the myth the crowd was currently building up in the stadium and dragging him back to the harsh, unforgiving reality of his own bruised flesh. He pushed open the heavy wooden door to the locker room. It was quiet inside, just the slow, steady drip of a leaky showerhead in the corner. Bruce sat down heavily on a wooden bench. The wood creaked under his weight. He looked at his hands. They were trembling. Purple, swollen, coated in dried blood and cheap canvas wax. He slowly reached into his gear bag, pulling out a roll of white athletic tape. He needed to bind the knuckles before the swelling completely immobilized his fingers. Above him, the stadium continued to shake with the roar of 45,000 people chanting his name. Bruce ripped a piece of tape with his teeth. He didn't smile. He just started wrapping the damage, alone in the dark. The giant fell, and the stadium witnessed the brutal reality of true combat. Bruce didn't just break the Viking, he shattered the illusion of weight class invincibility. Did the rawness of that final elbow strike leave you speechless? Smash that like button if you respect the uncompromising, gritty truth of martial arts over Hollywood myths. Share this story with someone who appreciates real combat psychology and hit subscribe to join our community. Drop a comment below. Would you have survived the Vikings' bear hug?